Mr. President.
Senator from Colorado.
Are we in a quorum call, Mr. President?
We are not.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm grateful to be on the floor here tonight with my colleague from California, Senator Schiff, and others to talk about the nomination of Tulsi Gabbard, now the successful confirmation, I guess, of Tulsi Gabbard to be the Director of National Intelligence. To say the least, I never thought that we would see a moment in the history of the United States, the history of our attempt as a Congress to ensure that the American people and that the President gets the intelligence they need. In all these years, over all these decades, I never imagined we'd see somebody like Tulsi Gabbard approved on the floor of the United States Senate for that job. And I wanted to speak tonight just briefly to say why I think that was the wrong direction for the Trump administration, more importantly that, the wrong direction for the American people. Let me say, first of all, intelligence, and being a member of the Intelligence Committee, I know this is unlike anything else we do around here. Because a lot of what happens, my colleague Senator King from Maine is here, a lot of what happens is done in secret. And one of the great privileges of being on the Intelligence Committee is that, I think in part because it's in secret, there isn't the kind of partisanship that you see in a lot of the other committees. There isn't the jockeying for position or for political notoriety. The people on that committee are very, very serious about our work, and in part it's because we all have a responsibility on behalf of all the senators that are not on the committee to be able to transmit as well as we can the intelligence needs of our country, the intelligence findings of the intelligence community, and to play a very important role in oversight. Because if we didn't provide that role, the intelligence agencies could run amok without the American people ever knowing about it, or their representatives knowing about it. In fact, the whole reason we have the Intelligence Committee in the Senate is because so many terrible decisions were made by the intelligence agencies in the post-war period in the 1950s and 1960s, some of it well-intentioned, during the Cold War, but a lot of it really bad judgments. It included things like the attempt to assassinate foreign leaders and to plot revolutions around the globe. And this Congress, this Senate, decided that we needed to have oversight for the American people. And we created the Intelligence Committee to do that. And it means that we have an institutional structure that ensures that the American people get the best service out of the intelligence community and that the President gets the best intelligence. And that structure was put in place by people who thought it was important for intelligence agencies not to run amok and for the President to get the best intelligence possible. And now we're putting somebody in the job of director of all the intelligence agencies, in a sense, the ODNI, so-called, who's kind of the clearinghouse and the coordinator for all the intel that the President gets, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard. Now, look, she's had a record of public service in the Congress and in the military, and I don't dispute that. And I'm not calling into question whether or not she's serving the interests of other countries. But I do want to say, and I will be brief, Mr. President, that I think her judgment has been extraordinarily, I would say, exceptionally bad. I share her view that there were profound intelligence errors in the lead up to the Gulf War and the lead up to the war in Afghanistan. In the Gulf in particular, we remember, the weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein was supposed to have. Didn't have it. Terrible, terrible failure of our Intelligence Committee, terrible failure of oversight from this Congress. And she's right about that. The problem is she's, I think, learned the wrong lesson from that. And over and over and over again, when she has the opportunity to support the interests of the United States, I hate to say it, versus those of our adversaries. Time and time again, she picks our adversaries. Or even our allies. I've heard her say how worried she is about what she describes as the remilitarization of Japan, which of course Japan is doing because of the threat from China with our very, very close cooperation. That's of concern to Tulsi Gabbard. She went to Syria and famously came back disputing our own intelligence agencies' findings about Assad's gassing of his own people. To this day, she hasn't really taken that back, and it makes no sense at all. But the thing that drives me the craziest, Mr. President, is that she has been an apologist for what Vladimir Putin has done since the day Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. Ukraine was a peaceful country with a peaceful border, and Vladimir Putin was the first tyrant since World War II ended. And we set up all of these multilateral institutions across Europe and across the world to prevent the kind of hostility that we had seen break out in World War II. And Vladimir Putin decided he would invade a peaceful country next door to him. And in his mind, he had a right to do that because Ukraine has been viewed by czars going back hundreds and hundreds of years as Russian territory. That is not the way the Ukrainian people look at this. They think of themselves as an independent country. They think of themselves as living in a place where history actually has moved on over the last 500 years or 1,000 years. And they were sitting there peacefully when Vladimir Putin invaded them with no provocation at all. And on the evening that Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, Tulsi Gabbard tweeted out at 11:30 at night, her local time, this war, referring to the war, Putin's invasion of Ukraine, this war and suffering could easily have been avoided if the Biden administration, NATO, had simply acknowledged Russia's legitimate security concerns regarding Ukraine's becoming a member of NATO, which would mean U.S. NATO forces right on Russia's border. Now, she gets mad when people read that stuff. That's what she said. And she says, well, don't tell people that I'm carrying propaganda for the Russian government or for Putin. That's not fair. I don't have to say that. But the Russian television put on TV in the days after the aftermath of Putin's invasion the very thing that Congressman Gabbard had said about his invasion, because they saw it as something that ratified what they had done. And it was so consistent, so aligned with his position, continues to be his position today, that he thought it would muddy the waters with people around the world about what they were doing in Ukraine. I believe Ukraine's battle from the very beginning has not been a battle for Ukraine. I think it's a battle for democracy. I think they are on the tip of the spear, in a way that nobody has been since World War II, and the Ukrainian people have been unbelievable. The Ukrainian soldiers have fought magnificently. There was a view when Putin invaded Ukraine, Mr. President, that in 3 days they were going to be in Kyiv, the Russians. And because of the bravery of the Ukrainian people, because of the bravery of the soldiers, many of whom have given up their lives, they have succeeded beyond the wildest dreams of anybody on this floor, of any of the Monday morning quarterbacking that's happened in this capital and other capitals around the world. And our allies all around Europe, but also in the Pacific area as well, all have seen what the Ukrainian people have accomplished. And when she had an opportunity to say something about the Ukrainians, when she had the opportunity to stand with the United States and stand with our allies, she made another choice. She's entitled to that choice. She's entitled to that choice, just as she's entitled to her views about the intelligence failures during the Gulf War. But the fact that she has the idiosyncratic views that she has, whether it's Putin's invasion of Ukraine or her writing a bill in the House to give Edward Snowden a pardon, that doesn't qualify her to be the lead intelligence official for the United States of America. As I said, and I'll finish here, Mr. President, we work well in a bipartisan way on these issues. The American people need the president to get intelligence in a way that's trustworthy, that is not shaded in one direction or another, and we all need to be able to trust each other in the delivery of that intelligence. And I will say that I think the president, in nominating Congresswoman Gabbard for this position, has fallen short. I voted for the CIA director. This is not an issue of his appointments to the intelligence agencies, but in the case of Congresswoman Gabbard, I think he missed the mark. And I apologize to my colleague from California for going on for so long. I will yield the floor to him.
Mr. President,
Senator from California.
after Tulsi Gabbard was selected as Donald Trump's nominee for Director of National Intelligence, the Russian newspaper Komsomolskaya Pravda was overjoyed. They wrote, "The CIA and FBI are trembling." Sadly, the Russian newspaper is probably right about that. Another Russian state outlet called her a comrade. On a separate broadcast, top Putin mouthpiece Vladimir Solovyov, after gushing about Kash Patel, said, "And what about our girl? We have our girl there." Our girl is evidently the Kremlin's way of referring to our nominee, Tulsi Gabbard. His guest asked so as to be sure, intelligence? The answer was yes. RT, yet another Russian outlet that Ms. Gabbard regularly read and shared articles from, took to Twitter to defend her. Quote, "We've got your back, Tulsi." Yes, they certainly do. In September, it was revealed that RT was acting covertly on behalf of Moscow to spread propaganda in the United States. Not a surprise that RT has Tulsi Gabbard's back. The question is, should we? The Director of National Intelligence is the nerve center of our nation's intelligence network. It is the linchpin between 18 agencies tasked with detecting and preventing threats to our national security and coordinating our intelligence resources. It's a job that requires judgment. It requires experience. It requires a high degree of trust. Above all, it requires a deep and unwavering commitment to the truth and a willingness to stand up to despots. And yet the nominee before us is stunningly lacking in all of these qualities. Ms. Gabbard's record in Congress is not one of distinction in intelligence matters. She did not serve on the Intelligence Committee in the House, was not known for advancing meaningful legislation on intelligence in this space. When she did sign on to legislation, it was to eliminate critically important intelligence programs, or it was to praise those who leaked classified information and did great damage to our nation, like Edward Snowden. She did not wrestle with the complexities of the intelligence gathering and analysis process. In fact, in the moments when her voice was heard on matters of foreign policy, it was in ways that should concern all of us. She has echoed, amplified, and at times outright defended the positions of autocrats and despots. When now deposed Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad gassed his own people, she cast doubt on the findings of our own intelligence agencies, cast doubt on them, just like the Russian propaganda outlets did. This after she engaged in her own form of freelance foreign policy, traveling to Syria to meet with Assad and get the full scoop on his government's narrative of that murderous crusade. On her return, she positively crowed about how lovely this dictator was. Quote, "He wants to be seen as someone who cares for his country." Well, maybe if he wanted to be seen as someone who cares for his country, he shouldn't have gassed his own people. He wants to be seen as someone who would not conduct these kind of atrocities, Tulsi Gabbard said, except that he did. He did commit these kinds of atrocities. When Vladimir Putin launched his brutal war against our ally Ukraine, she once again parroted Kremlin talking points about so-called provocations by NATO. She repeated Russia propaganda claims that the U.S. had set up secret bioweapons labs in Ukraine and argued that the U.S., not Russia, is responsible for Putin's nuclear brinksmanship. This is the nominee for our intelligence agencies, not the Kremlin's. This is our nominee, Tulsi Gabbard. This is who this president seeks to hand over the keys to our national security, to entrust her with the nation's most closely held secrets, to be the final voice in the room advising the president on intelligence, to be, in the plain words of the law, quote, the principal advisor to the president, to the National Security Council, and the Homeland Security Council for intelligence matters related to the national security. This, Tulsi Gabbard. This nomination is not just unwise, it is dangerous. Make no mistake, Ms. Gabbard is entitled to her own personal opinions. She can apologize for Assad or Putin or any other murderous dictator to her heart's content. But we're not considering Ms. Gabbard for some position in which her bizarre fondness for foreign despots is beside the point. She is not the nominee for Postmaster General. We're considering her for one of the most important jobs in our intelligence community. And for that, Tulsi Gabbard is a walking five-alarm fire and must be rejected, must be. There is a reason the Director of National Intelligence must have the confidence of both the intelligence professionals that oversee and the nonpartisan that they oversee in the national security establishment. Because the job requires accountability. It requires trust. It requires truthfulness. In 2015, Ms. Gabbard joined a congressional delegation trip to the Middle East, the kind that so many of us in this chamber have participated in. She visited a Turkish town near the Syrian border, where countless refugees were sheltering. Her guide took Ms. Gabbard to meet two Syrian girls aged just 9 and 4 years old, who had been badly burned in a bombing carried out by the Syrian dictator's warplanes. The children's parents had been killed in that attack. These brave, small children told their story to the then Congresswoman. Now, in this situation, I think any of us would have roughly the same response. Some form of sympathy, some form of empathy, some attempt to provide comfort to these children who saw their lives and their families destroyed in front of them. But Ms. Gabbard had a very different response. By the account of the guide who was with her, she looked at the children and said, "How do you know if it was Assad? What if it was ISIS?" I should note that ISIS, of course, has no air force. But of course, that wasn't really the point, was it? The point was perhaps best illustrated by her guide, who was with her to that day and who said that experience, those days with Ms. Gabbard, he said, quote, "It dawned on me that Tulsi wasn't misinformed or ignorant." He said he worried instead that she, quote, "had a worldview that was adversarial to the United States." Adversarial to the United States. Think about that. Adversarial to the United States. And consider whether this is the right person to be Director of National Intelligence. Where do we draw the line with Donald Trump? What level of unfitness in a nominee? What level of unconstitutionality in an executive action? What level of abject disregard of our judicial system? What national security threat or risk will it take? What action could he commit where we would be joined by our Republican colleagues in saying we've had enough? Where is the line? When is an action too egregious or an appointment too absurd, a risk or threat that is too big? Where is the line? Is it disobeying a lawful court order, which this administration seems to be laying the groundwork to do? Is it confirming a patently unqualified FBI director who wants to close down FBI headquarters and makes music with felons who beat law enforcement? Is it a director of HHS who doesn't believe in vaccines, or a director of national intelligence who has sought to undermine vital intelligence operations and whom the Russians and others viewed as aligned with them instead of with us? Where is the line? Because for me, that line has been crossed a long, long time ago. I will not support this nomination. And I urge my colleagues to think long and hard before they do. Because if Ms. Gabbard is confirmed, we will not need the luxury of hindsight. We already have the luxury of hindsight. The threats to our nation are real. Those who wish us harm are busy plotting against us. There are plots to conduct attacks on U.S. soil. There are intelligence warnings about China's intentions to replace U.S. influence around the world, and about Russia's relentless assaults against our friends and allies. And at a moment when the world is watching, when our allies and our adversaries are questioning America's stability and leadership on the global stage, we cannot afford to confirm a director of national intelligence who lacks the qualifications, the judgment, and the credibility to lead. We cannot. Remember that Russian broadcaster I mentioned earlier, Vladimir Solovyov. Here's some of the rest of that exchange with the guest on his show. Well, he said, with Tulsi Gabbard, it's not that simple. The guest replied, it might not work because what if it's not approved? The Russians are worried that Tulsi Gabbard might not be approved by this body. That should tell us something. People, please, do we need the Kremlin to spell it out for us? What they are hoping, and if they prayed, would be praying for us to do. Solovyov seemingly answered that question for us live on Russian TV. Quote, why are you suddenly so doubtful? He asked his guest. Solovyov seemed nervous about the chances for confirmation of the woman he described as our girl, Tulsi Gabbard. Perhaps he fears that Congress has more common sense than to confirm someone who prefers Russia's worldview over matters like Ukraine's sovereignty to our own national security professionals. But do we? Do we possess that basic common sense for the sake of our country, for the sake of our nation's most sensitive classified information, and for the sake of the workforce that keeps us safe? I hope and pray that we do, that we possess the common sense to vote down Tulsi Gabbard. We will soon find out, and I yield back.
The Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate be in a period of morning business for debate only, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I understand the chair has an announcement for the Senate.
The chair announces, the presiding officer, the chair announces on behalf of the Committee on Finance pursuant to Section 8002 of Title 26, U.S. Code, the designation of the following senators as members of the Joint Committee on Taxation. The senator from Idaho, Mr. Crapo, the senator from Iowa, Mr. Grassley, the senator from Texas, Mr. Cornyn, the senator from Oregon, Mr. Wyden, the senator from Washington, Ms. Cantwell.
Mr. President, I understand that there's a bill at the desk that's due for a second reading.
The clerk will read the bill, the title of the bill for the second time.
H.R. 29, an act to require the Secretary of Homeland Security to take into custody aliens who have been charged in the United States with theft and for other purposes.
Mr. President, in order to place the bill on the calendar under the provisions of Rule 14, I would object to further proceeding.
Objections having been heard, the bill will be placed on the calendar.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it stand adjourned until 10 a.m. on Tuesday, February 11th, that following the prayer and pledge, the journal of proceedings be approved today, at the morning hour be deemed expired, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day. Morning business be closed, and the Senate proceed to executive session and resume executive calendar number 18, that at all time during morning business, recess, adjournment, and leader remarks count post-cloture. Further, that the Senate recess from 12:30 p.m. until 2:15 p.m. to allow for the weekly conference meetings.
Without objection, so ordered.
If there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it stand adjourned under the previous order following the remarks of Senator Welch.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Vermont.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Donald Trump, as we all know, won the last election in November, and he's now the 47th President of the United States. But Donald Trump did not, contrary to what he and the Vice President want people to believe, win by anything close to a landslide. As this chart shows, out of a total of 155,238,302 votes, Mr. Trump won 77,302,000, or 49.8%. Kamala Harris won 75 million, or 48.3%. President Trump won, but just slightly over 2 million votes more than Kamala Harris. The difference between them was 1.5% of the popular vote. And although it was one of the smallest margins of victory in the since the 19th century, President Trump, in his inaugural address, and others in the inner circle of Trump, repeatedly called the victory a landslide, a blowout, a mandate, historic. You know what a real landslide is? Lyndon Johnson in 1964 won by 22.6%. Ronald Reagan won by 18.2%. Those are landslides. But why does it matter? Because facts matter. The truth matters. And we cannot survive in our democracy without respect, and much more respect, for the truth. It's also really important because when one goes, whether you're running for the U.S. Senate or the presidency of the United States, when one goes from candidate for office to the president or the U.S. senator in office, the responsibility that we have is to all the people in our district, and certainly for the president of the United States, a responsibility to all the people in the United States. We serve all, whether they voted for us or against us. But what has been happening with the assertion that this was this massive landslide is it has become a justification for narrow policies that completely disrespect the reality that so many other Americans need to be represented and heard, and also is so narrow that even among those who voted for President Trump for a variety of reasons are not getting policies they thought would be included. The America First policies so far have cut funding for programs to protect water that all Americans need, clean air that we all breathe, whether it is a voter who was for Trump or a voter who was for Harris. We are cutting funding for medical research for cancer, cures for kids who have cancer, for food assistance to the food malnourished kids and parents who are in every district in this country. And of course, most spectacularly, what we're seeing is the illegal termination of the USAID program, something the courts have rescinded, but the administration is rushing pell-mell nevertheless. All of this actually is in service of being able to find offsets in order to pay for the Trump tax cuts that are heavily weighted to folks who are billionaires like Mr. Musk, and of course to our major U.S. corporations. And you know what? The folks who need a tax cut are the everyday Americans who have been trying to make ends meet and are having real trouble doing that. The White House is not even trying to hide what they're doing. You've got Elon Musk. You know, it's pretty astonishing. He owns Twitter, which is a source of immense misinformation. He now is trying to buy ChatGPT. He has massive amounts of government contracts for Starlink and for space and for his space program. And he has contributed $280 million to the Trump campaign. And now, without any elected authority, without any advice and consent to the Senate on a position that is very powerful, the so-called Doge administrator, he has access to the private information of millions of Americans, all that confidential information about your Social Security and mine that's in the Treasury Department. So how is that happening? That is not in service of the folks who didn't vote for Mr. Trump. It's not even in service of the folks, of people who did. But you know, it's important that elections be, and the outcomes of elections be respected. You know, this last election, just like in 2020, the people who oversaw this election worked hard to ensure that it was free and fair. We don't all get the outcome that we want, but it was free and fair. The difference in this election is that we, on the losing side, accepted the result. We didn't falsely claim that it was stolen, the Stop the Steal narrative, as President Trump continues to assert about 2020, and most of his cabinet nominees do as well. We didn't try to prevent the outcome from being certified or to promote an insurrection by a violent mob, folks who actually attacked, injured people in this building and police officers, spit in their face, hit them with poles, and we had police officers who died after that attack. Falsely denying the outcome of an election and then using violence to overturn the result of a free and fair election absolutely subverts the democratic process. And as every American voter knows, free and fair elections, like the checks and balances between our three co-equal branches of government, are absolutely essential to the well-being and continuation of our democracy. You know, in the inaugural address that the president gave, I did not hear anything about child care or the cost of housing or bringing down the cost of prescription drugs and making health care more affordable. Things that everyday families in every single part of this country need help with, to be able to pay those bills and at the end of the month have their checkbook still balanced. If and when the president starts focusing on those issues, I and my colleagues are absolutely ready to work with him and our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, because those things, affordable broadband, affordable health care, affordable housing and rent, some economic security, those are things every single one of us needs. And the challenges that we face, whether it's red America or blue America, to try to have better policies to make that happen, are things that we must be working on together, but not where what comes first, last, and always are these tax cuts that explode the deficit and go to folks who are not now paying their fair share. So as long as President Trump and his allies pretend that he has this massive mandate to literally disrupt and throw out the traditions and norms and guardrails of democracy, that is something I and so many of my colleagues will resist. We can't do that. The law matters. Respect for your opponents matters. And focusing on the everyday needs of everyday people is what matters most. It's what is the goal all of us should be looking to accomplish. So, Mr. President, there was no mandate, no massive mandate. There was a victory. But with victory, to describe it as this smashing mandate is a suggestion that what awaits us and has already arrived is overreach and failure. Mr. President, I yield back.